Hi everyone, welcome to the week Climate Change Science and Consequences Near and Far. First, a massive apology for not appropriately selecting the microphone so that you could hear me. There was intended to be sound, and I ended up finishing it quite late before I flew to Winnipeg, which is why I missed that there was no sound. So, apologies for that. I had made a previous version which there was sound, so I'm kind of dumbfounded that that happened. So apologies for that. So this week, and as many of you have already fully engaged in, we are building our foundational knowledge of climate change science through learning and researching what climate change means for Canada. We will explore the Climate Change Atlas of Canada, which you can see here, and report back on how our local context will be affected by climate change according to no change in our greenhouse gas emissions and according to rapid greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. So just to give a little bit more clarity and insight to this, if you see on the screen I have right now, in the middle of the screen to the left, it says climate change less or more. And those different indicators allow you to choose if you want to see climate change more. So that means that it would be a business as usual approach. Or climate change less means that there would be a reduction in carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, by 2050 with a rapid decline in those greenhouse gas emissions. So you can look around the site to see what your specific area will look like according to those two emissions scenarios. Now you can also choose what kind of time period, so whether it's the recent past, the immediate future, 2021 to 2050, or the future, 2051 to 2080. And then you can select on the lower part where you see the different icons, those are the variables. So right now we have currently selected hot weather, and within hot weather there's a whole bunch of variables. So I selected very hot days, so with a temperature of above 30 degrees. So you can see the areas that will have that above 30 degree days temperature. But you can look and go through and see a whole bunch. So I would choose 2 or 3 different variables and look at them under climate change less, climate change more, and the various different time periods for your specific location, as the question in the discussion forum asks you to do. There are some other readings in that section on climate change science, which are very basic, and I encourage you, if you feel after reading them that you don't have understanding of climate change science, to go and do some more research on your own to get yourself caught up to speed. And it is a massive topic, so I just want you to have a really basic understanding of the climate change science so that we can have that foundational knowledge as a starting point. Under the topic consequences near and far, we delve into some of the frightening consequences of climate change. And these readings are not intended to deliberately scare you, but are required in order to convey the urgency of action required today in order to mitigate more severe consequences. And you can look through the NASA reading as well as the World Meteorological to read some of that. We've missed the window to avert climate change. We'll be living with climate-altered futures. However, the degree of the consequences is what is being negotiated. And in the Naomi Klein article, she poignantly makes the point. How will everything change under climate change? She writes, time is tight to be sure, but we could commit ourselves tomorrow to radically cutting our fossil fuel emissions and beginning the shift to zero carbon sources of energy based on renewable technology, with a full-blown transition underway within the decade. We have the tools to do that. And if we did, the seas would still rise and the storms would still come, but we would stand a much greater chance of preventing truly catastrophic warming. Indeed, entire nations could be saved from the waves. So it's an amazing essay. That's an excerpt from her text, How This Will Change Everything. And as I just earlier referenced to the NASA article in the World Meteorological Organization statement on global climate change, these are really just scientific summaries of some of the evidence of already occurring examples of climate change and predictions, such as temperatures will continue to rise between zero point 0.9 to 5.4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Frost-free seasons and growing seasons will lengthen, changes in precipitation patterns with a trend to increasing heavy precipitation events, more droughts and heat waves. Storms will become more dramatic and intense, and the Arctic will become ice-free by mid-century. So, all good news, really. So the next couple of readings start to look at the social impact of climate change. And Hannah and this slide here I forgot to show shows a 0.9 to 5.4 degree temperature change that I just spoke to. And as I also wanted to sort of emphasize that we're not going directly and reading the IPCC scenarios document or looking at the IPCC assessments reports in detail. If you are interested in looking at those reports or reading them, then please do. But I haven't assigned them as readings just because there's other readings that we can do, and at this point I don't think we need to focus on them. So as I said, the other readings start to focus on the social impact of climate change, and Hannah and Olivia systematically explain the implications of climate change on children in developing countries. And if you're feeling particularly overwhelmed after reading that one, make sure to give yourself a break and go for a walk. Soak up some sunshine and feel the warm spring air on your face. These readings are not intended to make you feel depressed about the state of the world, but are required so that we all know what we have, that we have the same foundational knowledge. And later we'll talk about the importance of taking action in your local area, and at times learning, reading, being exposed to global disaster, especially, or reading about children in far away countries that really you don't have the time, capacity, resources to enact systemic change for, then that can lead people with a feeling of apathy, depression, feeling disenfranchised. And so which is an important aspect of this psychology as you learn about climate change, and which is also very important for that we think about that in terms of how we scaffold this and how we talk about developmental readiness for young people. Because they will also experience some of those very difficult hardship fallout emotions that come with starting to understand the amount of degradation that we are in and that will occur. This image is of the Global Education Monitoring Report for 2016, which has a really great chapter on climate change education. So I've included that, but also it has a whole bunch of smiling young people who many will be affected by the impacts of climate change. The article Climate Change is a Global Megatrend for Sovereign Risk develops an argument of how climate change will drive global inequity by the most vulnerable countries to climate change are also the poorest. These countries will become increasingly unstable as they are unable to borrow credit to address wicked economic, social, and ecological crises occurring within their borders. And I added this article also because it references the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, which you also will go to. And you'll do some research to see which countries will be the most affected by climate change and which ones are the most which ones are the most ready. So also that have invested in it or that are finding ways to be resilient. So check out Canada while you're in there. And the last video that's listed is an apology letter to future generations. But before you leave and think that this video and the other readings have written our future in stone, remember the window is quickly closing, but it has not shut yet. And this is the urgency which we need to understand and act from in order to mitigate worst case scenarios. Lastly, I wanted to just also add these two articles um, that come from recent climate change news. So the Prime Minister of Australia has allocated just under 500 million for mitigating climate change in the Great Barrier Reef, which is vulnerable to climate change factors such as ocean acidification, rising sea temperatures, and stronger and more frequent cyclones, which diminish or destroy coral beds. And there's some skepticism about whether this is enough to actually be able to save the reef. But the reef is one of those places that is an indicator for the resiliency of some life systems. So it's an important one to watch. And then the other article is around sort of what's happening in the political realm around Canada being able to meet its carbon emission targets. So in Canada, the British Columbian provincial government, the other piece to this article is around the Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, which I'm sure many of you are aware. There's a lot of controversy and protest happening where the BC government has been resisting that being built in British Columbia, and Alberta has been sort of throwing its weight around to say that it needs to go through. Now, the British Columbian government has asked the province's top court to clarify whether it has the constitutional authority to regulate the amount of bitumen oil that transits through its territory. During our course, there will be lots of media coverage on the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, so if you're interested in this issue, maybe consider giving the class new updates as your choice assignment. Also in Canada, the government of Saskatchewan has also gone to its top court to challenge the authority of the federal government to impose a carbon tax on provinces that fail to take steps to meet the carbon pricing threshold set by Ottawa. So if Saskatchewan gains ground, then it may lead to more battles dependent on the outcomes of provincial elections in Ontario and Alberta. So PC candidate for Ontario, Doug Ford, and PC candidate Jason Kenney in Alberta have both indicated they will fight the carbon pricing threshold set by the Canadian federal government. So if we have three provinces that are going to fight the federal government on the carbon tax, then will Canada meet its targets? And this is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out in the next Alberta election, Ontario election, and what the ruling is for this particular issue with Saskatchewan's premier taking it to the highest court in Saskatchewan. So I just wanted to apologize again that the sound was not working on my initial video, and if you are interested or you're still mulling about what you're going to do for your climate change communication project, then maybe following the Kinder Morgan Trans Pipeline is one, maybe following some of the elections and what that's going to mean in terms of climate change policy is another lead. Or if you want to follow what's happening in the Great Barrier Reef around climate change policy, by all means do that and give us news updates. But I hope you are enjoying the course so far, and I am back now from Winnipeg and no longer have any other disruptions in my schedule for the rest of the course. So sincere apologies for